The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the small southern town as Bill Thompson, a 70-year-old Vietnam veteran, made his way through the familiar streets. Despite his age, Bill walked tall, his back straight, a presence still commanding respect. Known for his service and his countless acts of kindness in the community, he was beloved by all who knew him. That day, after spending hours at the local Veterans Hall reminiscing with friends, Bill was on his way home when he noticed something unsettling. Across the park, he saw Officer Henry Porter, a tall, burly man notorious for his aggressive demeanor. Porter was standing over a young man, clearly intimidating him, while a small crowd gathered at a distance, unsure whether to intervene or walk away. Bill's instincts, forged in the chaos of war, kicked in. He knew trouble when he saw it. Without hesitation, Bill approached the scene, his calm demeanor and deep voice cutting through the tension. "Is everything all right here, officer?" he asked. Porter turned, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Bill. "This is none of your business, old man. Keep moving." But Bill did not back down. He spoke with the wisdom of his years, urging Porter to let the frightened young man go. Porter, fueled by anger and the need to assert dominance, lashed out. Without warning, he shoved Bill. The older man stumbled back but still stood tall, unwilling to be intimidated. Anger boiled within Porter, and before anyone could react, he swung his fist, striking Bill across the face. Bill crumpled to the ground, his head hitting the pavement with a sickening crack. The crowd erupted in shock. Phones were pulled out, and people rushed forward to help Bill as he lay motionless. Blood began pooling beneath his head. Porter, realizing what he had done, reached for his radio, trying to regain control by twisting the narrative, but it was too late. The damage had been done. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. The bystanders were paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Then, a woman stepped forward, her voice breaking the silence. "Someone call an ambulance." Panic was evident in her tone. The young man Porter had been harassing stood wide-eyed, trembling with shock, unsure of what would happen next. The sirens blared in the distance, growing louder by the second. People anxiously waited, some comforting each other, others whispering about the injustice they had just witnessed. It wasn't long before paramedics arrived, rushing to Bill's side, carefully assessing his injuries. They worked swiftly, lifting him onto a stretcher and securing his neck. The sight of Bill, a respected elder, lying there so fragile struck a chord in the hearts of those who had gathered. Officer Porter watched from a distance, his face pale, his bravado completely stripped away. The whispers among the crowd grew louder, fueled by anger and disbelief. Porter knew this was not something he could easily brush aside. He had overstepped, and everyone around knew it. As the ambulance doors closed, the paramedics exchanged grim glances, unsure of Bill's fate. Bill's body was loaded into the ambulance, and as it sped away, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind a sense of confusion, unease, and anger. A few stayed behind, continuing to film Porter as he barked orders into his radio, desperately trying to paint himself as the victim. But those who had been there knew better. They had seen a man of honor brought down by abuse of power, and the injustice of it all lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The events of that late afternoon would not be forgotten. The story of William Thompson's bravery, his refusal to back down in the face of injustice, would soon spread across the town, igniting a flame of determination among the residents to demand accountability and change. And for Officer Porter, the consequences of his actions were only just beginning. That evening, Bill's son, David Thompson, received a call that would change everything. David, the Attorney General for the state, was known for his tenacity in the pursuit of justice. The call came from a shaken bystander who had witnessed the brutal assault. The voice on the other end was trembling as they informed David that his father had been attacked by an officer and was now in a coma at the hospital. David's heart sank. The news hit him like a freight train. His father, the man who had always been his rock, was now fighting for his life because of senseless violence. Shock turned to determination as David packed up his briefcase and left his office. He was no longer just a worried son. He was the Attorney General, and he knew he needed to bring those responsible to justice. Arriving at the hospital, David was met with the cold sterility of the emergency room. His eyes quickly found his father, lying motionless on the bed, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of machines. Seeing Bill, a man who had always stood tall and proud, now helpless and unresponsive, filled David with a mixture of sorrow and anger. He approached the bedside, taking his father's hand gently. The sight was almost too much to bear, but David knew he had to stay strong, not just for his father, but for every person who had suffered under a system that allowed officers like Henry Porter to act without consequence. Standing by his father's side, David made a silent promise. He would fight until justice was served. He pulled out his phone, immediately contacting his legal team. Within minutes, he had set the wheels in motion. "I want a full investigation into this officer," he ordered, his voice filled with controlled fury. "I want every report, every complaint, and every piece of evidence that shows this wasn't an isolated incident." The following day, news of the attack began to spread. Video footage taken by bystanders had gone viral overnight, showing the brutal attack on an elderly veteran, a man known and loved in his community. The public outcry was swift and intense. Across the town, people were horrified that such an injustice could happen in their streets. Protesters began to gather outside the police station, demanding answers and calling for Officer Porter's immediate suspension. David held a press conference later that afternoon, standing in front of the hospital where his father lay. His voice, steady and authoritative, echoed across the crowd of reporters and concerned citizens. "This is not just about my father," David said, his gaze unwavering. "This is about holding those who abuse their power accountable and ensuring this never happens again." His words struck a chord, and the gathered crowd erupted in support. The message was clear. People were ready for change, and David was determined to lead the charge. The investigation unfolded rapidly. David's team began uncovering a troubling history of complaints against Officer Porter, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and intimidation. Each complaint had been dismissed, each warning ignored. The deeper they dug, the more it became apparent that this was not an isolated issue but a systemic failure that had allowed Porter to continue abusing his power without repercussions. David met with community leaders, civil rights activists, and his father's fellow veterans, forming a coalition to push for accountability and reform. He knew that holding Porter responsible was just the beginning. The real change needed to happen within the entire department, from the officers on the beat to those in leadership positions who had turned a blind eye for far too long. As the pressure mounted, David found himself balancing the roles of a grieving son and a relentless advocate for justice. He spent his days in meetings and strategy sessions, his nights by his father's bedside, speaking softly to Bill, urging him to hang on. The fight had only just begun, but David was ready for it. He had his father's strength and the support of a community that refused to remain silent. And as the sun set on the town that night, the flicker of hope had been ignited. A hope that justice would prevail and that change was on the horizon. David held a press conference in front of the courthouse, his calm yet authoritative voice resonating with the crowd. "This is not just about my father," he said, looking into the cameras. "This is about holding those who abuse their power accountable and making sure this never happens again." His words were met with applause and cheers, and people across the town rallied behind him, demanding justice for Bill. As David and his team began their investigation, they uncovered a disturbing pattern. Officer Porter had a history of complaints, including multiple allegations of excessive force and racial profiling. All of these had been swept under the rug by the department, allowing him to continue unchecked. It became clear that this wasn't just about one bad cop, this was a systemic failure. Determined to see justice done, David decided to go further. He wanted to make sure that not only was Porter held accountable, but that the entire department underwent reforms to prevent future abuses. He reached out to community leaders, civil rights activists, and fellow veterans, forming a coalition that was determined to bring about real change. The investigation's findings were damning. Evidence showed that complaints against Porter had been ignored for years, and some had even been actively covered up by senior officials. It wasn't just Officer Porter who was culpable. Those at the highest levels of the police department had played a part in shielding him from accountability. The chief of police, Harold Collins, was implicated in the cover-up, and the pressure for his resignation began to mount. David and his coalition called for transparency and accountability at every level of the department. They demanded an independent review of all complaints filed against officers over the last decade, pushing for a complete overhaul of how misconduct was handled. The community, united by outrage and a desire for change, showed up in droves to support David's efforts. Town hall meetings were packed, and petitions calling for Chief Collins' resignation garnered thousands of signatures within days. The pressure was building, not just from within the community but from across the state. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was national news. A decorated Vietnam veteran attacked by an officer with a history of misconduct, whose abuses had been ignored by the department for years. The public outcry was overwhelming, and it became clear that this was no longer just a local issue. People everywhere were demanding justice and reform. Chief Collins, once confident in his position, now found himself in a precarious situation. He was summoned to a private meeting with the mayor, who had grown increasingly concerned about the damage this scandal was doing to the town's reputation. The mayor made it clear that Collins had two choices: resign voluntarily or face a formal investigation that could end in his removal. Collins, his face drawn and tired, knew the writing was on the wall. As the investigation continued, David worked tirelessly, balancing his role as the Attorney General with his duties as a son. Every night, he returned to the hospital to sit by his father's side, sharing the progress they were making and reassuring Bill that his fight had not been in vain. Though Bill remained unconscious, David spoke to him as if he could hear every word, drawing strength from his father's resilience. David's coalition also pushed for legislative changes, proposing a bill that would establish an independent oversight committee for police misconduct cases statewide. It was a bold move, but one that was met with widespread support. People were tired of the old ways, of seeing those in power protect their own at the expense of justice. The proposed reforms represented hope, a chance to create a system that was fair and accountable. By the end of the week, Chief Collins announced his resignation, and the town erupted in applause. It was a victory, but David knew it was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, with many battles left to fight. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense that true change was possible. And as David stood before the courthouse once more, addressing the cheering crowd, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that his father's sacrifice would lead to a better future for everyone. The day of Officer Porter's arrest finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the town was electric. The courthouse steps were filled with protesters, reporters, and community members, all demanding justice for Bill Thompson. People held signs, some with Bill's picture, others with words like "Justice for Bill" and "No more abuse of power." Porter was led out of a police car in handcuffs, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a look of genuine fear. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his actions had real, unavoidable consequences. As Porter was escorted into the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Some in cheers, others in anger, but all united in the belief that justice was finally within reach. Inside the packed courtroom, David Thompson stood at the front, prepared to present his case. David, both as Attorney General and as a son, had worked tirelessly to bring this moment to fruition. He spoke with passion, his voice unwavering as he laid out the charges against Porter: assault, misconduct, and abuse of authority. David began by painting a vivid picture of what had happened that day in the park. He spoke of his father, a 70-year-old Vietnam veteran who had always stood for what was right, stepping in to help a young man being harassed. He described how Officer Porter, fueled by aggression and unchecked power, had attacked Bill, leaving him in a coma. David's voice was calm but firm, each word resonating with the weight of the injustice his father had suffered. David looked Porter directly in the eye as he spoke, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "My father served his country with honor. He fought for the freedoms that every one of us enjoys today," David said, his voice breaking slightly but still steady. But that day, his own rights were stripped from him by someone who was supposed to protect him. We cannot allow those who are meant to serve and protect us to abuse their power without consequences. Today, we take the first step in ensuring that justice is served. The judge listened intently, her expression serious. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, the video footage from bystanders, and the long history of complaints against Porter that had been ignored. The courtroom was silent as David finished his statement, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. When it was Porter's turn to speak, his attorney tried to argue that his actions had been in the heat of the moment, that he had felt threatened, but the argument fell flat. The witnesses had been clear, the videos indisputable. Porter had acted out of malice, not self-defense. The judge did not hesitate. She denied Porter bail, stating that the charges were severe and the risk to public safety too great. Porter would await trial behind bars. As the news of Porter's denial of bail spread, the crowd outside erupted in applause. The sense of relief and hope was palpable. Finally, there was a feeling that the system was working, that justice was being served. People hugged one another, tears streaming down their faces as they celebrated this long-awaited moment. For too long, they had watched those in power escape accountability, but today was different. David stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by the cheers of the gathered crowd. Reporters shouted questions, microphones were thrust in his direction, but David raised his hand for silence. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "Today, we took a stand, not just for my father, but for every person who has ever faced injustice at the hands of those sworn to protect them. We will not rest until real, lasting change is achieved." The crowd cheered louder, their voices echoing off the courthouse walls. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. Justice was beginning to be served, and the community was ready to continue the fight. As David looked out at the sea of faces, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, he knew that his father's struggle had not been in vain. Together, they were making a difference, and together, they would ensure that no one else would suffer the way Bill had. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning, and the people were ready to see it through. With Officer Porter in custody, David turned his focus to the police department itself. Chief Harold Collins, unable to withstand the mounting evidence of his role in covering up Porter's misconduct, resigned in disgrace. The community celebrated his resignation as another victory, a sign that the system was finally being held accountable. It was a moment of triumph, a sign that change was not only possible but already happening. David worked tirelessly with local leaders to implement new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power. Mandatory body cameras were introduced, providing transparency and accountability in every interaction between officers and civilians. An independent review board was established to handle complaints against the police. No longer would grievances be buried or ignored. Community outreach programs were also put into place, designed to build trust between the police and the people they served. The goal was clear: to create a police department that treated all citizens with integrity, fairness, and respect. These reforms were not without their challenges. There was resistance from some officers who were set in their ways, unwilling to accept the new level of scrutiny. But David and his coalition were steadfast. They held training sessions, invited experts in de-escalation tactics, and encouraged officers to engage with the community in positive ways. Slowly but surely, the culture within the department began to shift. As these changes were being implemented, Bill Thompson began to show signs of improvement. Slowly but surely, he regained consciousness, his eyes fluttering open for the first time in weeks. The day Bill woke up, David was there, holding his hand. Tears filled David's eyes as he looked into his father's, a mixture of relief, love, and gratitude washing over him. Despite everything, despite the violence, the injustice, the weeks of uncertainty, Bill was still here. His resilience was a testament to the strength that had always defined him. Bill's recovery was slow, but each day brought progress. He began to speak, his voice weak but determined, and he would smile whenever David told him about the changes happening in the town. The community rallied around Bill, offering support and love in countless ways, bringing meals, sending cards, and even organizing fundraisers to help cover medical expenses. The once fractured town had come together, united by the fight for justice and the desire to create a safer, fairer place for everyone. David often brought news of the reforms to his father's hospital room, sharing the victories they had achieved together. He spoke of the independent review board, of the new policies that were taking root, and of the officers who were beginning to embrace change. Bill, though still weak, found comfort in knowing that his ordeal had sparked a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on the town he loved. His fight had not been in vain. It had become the catalyst for a transformation that was long overdue. The town, once filled with tension and distrust, now buzzed with a sense of hope. The changes in the police department were just the beginning. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began to come together, organizing events to strengthen their community. Barbecues, cleanup days, and open forums became regular occurrences. Opportunities for people to connect, to share, and to heal. The bonds between the residents and the officers who patrolled their streets grew stronger, built on mutual respect and understanding. For David, the journey was far from over, but he could finally see the progress they had made. Standing on the porch of his father's house one evening, watching as children played and neighbors chatted, David felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The road to justice had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. Bill, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand and smiled. "You did good, son," he whispered, his voice still soft but full of pride. David looked at his father, his heart swelling. "We did it, Dad. Together." Months later, Bill sat in his wheelchair on the porch of his home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees around him, and the soft laughter of children playing nearby filled the air. Beside him, David sat, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight for justice had not been easy, but it had been worth it. They had faced corruption, violence, and resistance, but in the end, they had emerged victorious, not just for themselves but for the entire community. David turned to his father, his voice filled with emotion. "You know, Dad, you taught me to always stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is." Bill smiled, his eyes still carrying the strength and warmth they always had. "And you did just that, son. You made me proud." His voice, though still a little weak, was steady, full of the quiet determination that had always defined him. The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of their journey finally beginning to lift. The last few months had been a whirlwind of emotions: fear, hope, triumph, and relief. Bill knew that his fight had sparked real change, and David knew that his role as Attorney General was more than just a job. It was a calling to protect and serve the people, just like his father had always done. The sense of purpose that had guided them through the darkest of times was now a beacon of hope for the community. The town had transformed in ways neither of them could have imagined. The police department, once marred by corruption and distrust, was now a symbol of accountability and positive change. Officers were working closely with community members, building relationships based on respect rather than fear. The Independent Review Board had become a pillar of transparency, ensuring that complaints were heard and acted upon. And the people, neighbors who had once been strangers, were now united in a shared vision of a better future. David glanced at his father, taking in the sight of Bill's eyes, which were fixed on the horizon. He could see the pride in them, the satisfaction of knowing that his suffering had not been in vain. It had been a catalyst for change, a spark that had ignited a movement, and now they were witnessing the fruits of that struggle. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple out and make a difference. "It's amazing, isn't it?" David said, breaking the silence. "How people can come together when it matters most." Bill nodded, his gaze still on the sky. "People just need a reason, son. They need hope. And sometimes, it takes something like this to remind them of what really matters." He turned to David, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You gave them that hope. You showed them that justice is possible." As the sun dipped below the horizon, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be those who tried to stand in the way of progress. But he also knew that as long as there were people like his father, people who were willing to stand up and fight for what was right, there would always be hope. Bill reached out, placing his hand on David's. "Promise me one thing," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "Promise me you'll keep fighting, not just for me, but for everyone who needs it." David squeezed his father's hand, his own eyes filling with emotion. "I promise, Dad. I'll keep fighting. For you and for all of us." As the story comes to a close, we want to thank you, our viewers, for for joining us on this journey. The fight for justice and equality is one that requires all of us to stand together. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What would you do if you were in David's shoes? Or in Bill's? Share your thoughts in the comments below or send us an email. Your stories matter, and together, we can continue to make a difference. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. And remember, justice and compassion are values we must all strive for, no matter our age or background. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to hearing from you.